First, thank you very much. Everybody who is coming on the first sessions at 11 would treat them as saints and heroes. This is basically our only alternative to going to the church. But secondly, I'm also extremely grateful for you coming, because for me personally, this is a great opportunity. In the recent books, one of the books that made the strongest impression on me was Olivier Roy's book, The Crisis of Culture, which we are going to talk about. And I really was lucky because I was asked to review it. And at least I'm convinced that it's a very important book. So what I'll do is first say just 2 or 3 words about Olivier Roy for those who are not following him. But for those who are interested, there is a book interview with him, which was published some years ago. And this is basically the title, In the Search of the Lost Orient, which is a book interview about his intellectual trajectory. And listen, his intellectual trajectory is not going to be reduced to where he has been teaching and what kind of books he has written. He started on the left of Mao in 1968. So he was basically so much on the left that basically you cannot get out of the map. But then he did something that very few people were doing. And I do believe this is very important, at least in the way I was reading the book about his approach. And then he decided to learn about a totally different culture that he didn't know, place that he didn't know. And he basically walked Afghanistan in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, Afghanistan was walkable. And he decided to learn the language. He learned Farsi. He was basically going here and there. And he tries basically to try to understand the world from a particular place. At the end of the 1970s, after the Soviets invaded, Afghanistan became a popular place. So he has been there, and he spent some time with the Mujahideens. And then when everybody was starting to be interested in Islam and going to the Middle East, he basically tried to get his understanding of the political trajectory of Islam being in Central Asia. He's always going to a place that nobody was going before him, and after that it becomes a popular place. So obviously, if he decides to move to the tourist industry, he's going to do very well. And his work on political Islam, and basically to what extent we're talking about radical Islam and so on, was extremely influential. I know that probably many of you here have been reading these books, knows the debate. And his position was very different than the one that was popular among most of the colleagues. And in France, you have a really important debate on this. While everybody was focusing on kind of a domestic sources of the radicalization of Islam, his story was the type of a political Islam that we talk about is much more globalization phenomena. And secondly, which I found very much interesting, in order to understand what is happening, keep in mind that simply in the way the resentment in the 1970s was colored in red. In 1990s, it was colored in green. I mean the green not in terms of the climate, but in terms of Islam. And I'm saying this because, of course, as you can imagine, this produces huge debates. And then we're moving to this book, which I hope we're going to have a time to talk about, because he came with a book which looks so unpretentious that if you're not going to read carefully, you're going to believe that you know most of the things. But it is not true. Because his major argument is that what we are seeing now is not change of one dominant culture with another, but basically we see kind of the crisis of the very idea of culture, that this is really radical, and for him, when he means culture, he means both the anthropological reality of the local cultures, but also of the national canons. So before moving to you in order to develop your major ideas, when I was reading the book, I was reminded about something that probably some of you know. In 1919, there was an idea that the official language of the Soviet Union should be Esperanto. No, this was discussed. It was discussed on the Council of Ministers, because as you can imagine, if you have the Russian as the major language, and back then people were very much, the Bolsheviks were really aware of the chauvinism, of the Russian chauvinism and so on, they wanted a language that was equally distanced from any of the cultures of the empire. So you should try to create something artificial and doing this. Reading Olivier Roy's book, in a certain way, we succeeded. We're not come with the Esperanto, but for example, if you look at the Google Translate, this is the first translator in the world who does not have a native language. And I'm very much interested for you to develop your major argument, so we are going to have, after that possibility, I'm going to ask some questions, and then you're going to enter the discussion. So please, Olivier.
Thank you very much. It's quite difficult to speak about my works after what has been said. I appreciate much a lot, by the way. My idea is that what we have now is not, a crisis of culture as we have regularly. The French Revolution was also a crisis of culture, or a crisis inside a culture. The Soviet Revolution also. But we have a crisis of the very concept of culture. What we are going towards is deculturation. We don't need anymore to refer either to a high culture, the poets, the novelists, art, etc., or to an anthropological culture. Let's take the example of the language. Regularly, in world history, we have a dominant culture. The process of globalization did exist. The Roman Empire was a typical example of regional, of course, globalization. And the Roman Empire was extended, very extended from Atlantic to the Euphrates, to Mesopotamia. It had many, many different languages, people, etc. So Latin was not only the official language, but at least on the west of the Roman Empire, it was the communication language, and Greek on the east of the empire was also the communication language. But both languages did refer to a very specific culture. When you had to learn Greek, well, you read Homer, you read Plato, Aristoteles, etc., etc. When you learned Latin, you learned Latin by learning Virgilius, by the poets, etc. So globalization was not just a matter of communication, it was not an Esperanto, it was learning a real culture which tend to be global. And Latin, for centuries, was the language of globalization, at least in the West, and people, very young, they had to learn Latin, not just Latin language, but Latin culture. I probably was one of the last generation where still, we started to learn Latin at the age of 10 or 11 years, and to do, I studied Latin for 10 years. It was very boring, by the way, already, but that was part of humanities. In the 18th century, French became the communication language of Europe, and people who learned French, like the Russian aristocrats, the Habsburg, what you want, they learned the French culture. They knew about La Fontaine, Racine, etc., etc. Same thing with the English in the 19th century. But now, what do we have? We have Globish, not English. And Globish is a language which is based on English, sure, but it's a simplified English. In the sense that you may speak very good English, but you don't know if the person in front of you does speak the same English than you, or does know as much as you know. So automatically, we have some sort of a logiciel of simplification. For instance, we are not sure that the guy I am speaking to knows the term sibling. I'm not sure. But I am sure that he knows brother and sisters. So I drop siblings and I speak about brother and sisters, etc., etc. So we have a language of about 1,000, 2,000 words, plus 100 of technical words according to your job. And you are not supposed to know English literature because it may complicate the communication. And it's not because it's not you who decide not to refer to literature. It's the system itself. Google Translation is a translation without any cultural referential. And it's why it works. I give you another example, the European Union. Officially, we can speak 27 languages. On your passport, you have all these languages, including Gaelic, for instance. So, and all these languages are official. But by definition, in the language of Brussels is Globish. They have a huge translating system, apparatus. You have hundreds and hundreds of translators, interpreters, etc., etc. And so you have instructions. And when you look at how they are trained precisely to deculturalize their own language. It's written, in my book I mentioned the directive. When you speak your own language, please avoid any references to your national culture. Because you are not sure that the translator would understand very well. It will take time, and there might be some misunderstanding. So speak a language without any cultural references. One of the consequences is no jokes, except yesterday night, of course, but sometimes, that's the old generation.
American still has the privilege to joke. Yeah.
But you should not do jokes. Or if you do joke, you have to put an emoji saying, this is a joke. And the people, they laugh after seeing the emoji. Because before they don't know. Maybe they don't understand anything. Maybe they find that it's funny, but they're not sure that it's appropriate, to find it funny. But once you have the emoji, laugh, okay, you can laugh. So the second part of this deculturation is normativity. You are told how you should think. And your attitudes have to be codified. So we have a lot of series of codification. Emoji is the codification of emotions. And so your emotion cannot be mixed, or you may use mixed emoji, but it has to be very precise. I am laughing and crying at the same time. But if you do something where you are laughing and crying at the same time, nobody will understand. So you have to explicit your emotions by using emoji. Now you are instructed not to be ambivalent. Yes is yes, no is no. Which in some circumstances, for example, sexual relations, might be good. I am not saying it's bad. I'm just describing how we are shifting from a cultural, shared culture, where we have a lot of implicit things, to non-culture, to a system of communication which is settled to avoid, any implicit, and hence to avoid any culture. Culture is by definition implicit. When we are inside our own culture and language, we do not explicit everything at all. For instance, you can speak German without knowing the German grammar. You can speak without codifying what you say. The grammar always comes after the language, never before, except for Esperanto. We have body language. In every culture, we know that a jest, a way to put your hands, to smile or not to smile, to make a sign, the head off or down, so has a meaning, and you understand the meaning. The problem is that, of course, body languages are embedded in specific cultures. And when you travel, you know that it's a big problem, because you may make a gesture with a totally different meaning in the other culture. So what to do? To avoid body language or to recodify body language. High five, okay, everybody understand. It's taken from America. This is taken from India. So we take isolated cultural markers, we take them outside their culture, and we decide that, okay, this marker is part of a global code. a global codification of comportments. And you are allowed to use them, but only to use them and in precise circumstances. This is a condition for the present globalization that we are knowing, which is not the spread of an American culture. It's not, so some people will say there is no American culture. I will not enter into that, you know. But what is now globalized under the concept of Americanization is not a culture. And we can say that English, the American English, is more adapted to this kind of globalization than Chinese or Japanese. But it's very interesting to say that Japan, where you have a very complex, you know, and inward-looking culture, is producing some of the best tools of the global communication. Emoji, and in the arts, mangas. Mangas now is part of this new culture of entertainment, which is not rooted on a given culture. Every kid, you know, everywhere in the world might appreciate mangas, even if the mangas are a product, you know, of a century-old Japanese culture. So the Japanese are very good in deculturizing their own culture. They did that for the cars, for instance, but they do also that for the arts. It's a footnote, so I will not go too far because I would have to add footnotes, and in speaking, it's not appropriate.
Yeah, but thank you very much, because I'll try to kind of push you what it means. Because in my view, this is, if deculturalization is what is happening, how this is affecting the place in which we're living and the time in which we're living. And if you see what is culture, culture is very much connected to the idea of being at home. So, by the way, in English, when you tell somebody, feel free and feel home, this is basically perceived as synonymous. Because home is a place you believe that you understand, and where you believe that you understood, without the need basically to go to any kind of a really decodification. So suddenly, in my view, and this was in my view very well revealed in the book, is that this decultured world is becoming a homeless world. Suddenly, you feel basically homeless, regardless of where you're living, even when you're living in your own place, because your place is changing. You cannot take for granted that the other side, somebody whom you're going to meet on the street, implicitly is going to understand what you are saying or not saying. And for me, this is quite important because it's also not true only about places, but also about time. I also read it in the book. I hope that I didn't misread it. But one of the things that very much was making a strong impression on me, particularly when you see some of the way the younger generation is interpreting history, you're going to see that they are treating everybody, both dead and alive, as their contemporaries. Listen, I have been socialized in the communist period, and we were very much taught that there were people that were progressive in their time. Spartacus was progressive in his time. He was not a communist, but he was going in the right direction. But now everybody whom you're treating basically is as if he's living today. So in a certain way, the fact that Thomas Jefferson has a slave is as outrageous as if Joe Biden is going to have a slave. And in my view, this is interesting because deculturizations mean decontextualization, not only in terms of different geographies, but also in terms of different times. And this creates a feeling that you basically are living like the last man. And this was for me very interesting because in a certain way, the political implications are very important. Because on one level, I do believe we're rightly told, be careful not to offend the sensibilities of others who are not like you, but on the other side, you are told you are never going to be able to feel the world as somebody who is not like you. And you're in a different situation. How not to offend if I cannot basically put in the shoes of this person? I find these contradictions extremely important And politically, I'm very much interested because you have been thinking, because you tell also where you believe are the sources of this globalization coming. I'm very much interested of how you believe this is changing the way we live. We do politics, we do business, basically we do science. So this is the directions in which I want to push you to develop your thought.
The title of the book in French is The Flattening of the World. And this flattening is at two levels. One is spatial, so you have no transcendence, no God, no religion, no humanity, and so. You have no down, no animals. Animals are put on the same level than humans. We are all sentient now, that's a new term. Animals, some courts and laws, they give legal personality to animals, which is quite new. But also this flattening is in time, as you said, and history is disappearing. So when we speak about, we don't speak about past societies. This kind of history is no more taught. We speak about individuals, Napoleon, Colbert, Jefferson, the Queen Victoria, and so. And the question is, were these people good in the normative terms that we are using now? So everything they did which is not good according to our perception now, like having slaves, being racist, of course, being misogynistic, etc., having many wives, and so on, is now a political statement. And this has nothing to do with what the historical personages did or not. So we have a retrospective moral appreciation of the past without understanding that we are the product of this past. And for instance, in France, to blame Colbert because he wrote the Black Code, so the codification of slavery. He did codify slavery for the French colonies, but he did a lot of other things. But the bad things also are part of our legacy. It explains a lot, how we became what we became. But no, it's a purely moral statement. And the paradox is that the more we are analyzing what is going on in moral terms, the more we are unable to cope with violence. We have less and less political, in this, even the cynical sense of the term, than we used to have before. You mentioned my past, so I didn't
Your glorious past.
Yeah, I didn't want to come back to that. But my generation was very politicized. For good and very bad reasons. No, it's a mix. We were revolutionaries, wanted to change everything. So we were violent. We went to the streets, we fought with the police, we went to the plants, we pushed the workers to go on strike, and also we went abroad to join different guerrillas. Fortunately for me, the guerrilla I wanted to join, it did not work. So it was Dhofar in Oman, so I went through Yemen in 70, and we were stopped just before crossing the border. Because the previous convoy was totally destroyed by British SAS officers and Baluchi commandos. So, and it was my last endeavor to join a leftist guerrilla. Now, my students, they are, in a sense, very politicized. They look at what is going on in the world. They read the newspaper. They make statements and so on. But they don't go to the streets. They don't go to fight. I'm happy that they don't go to fight, and don't want to be misquoted on that. They remain in the campus of the university, and they protest. They protest against the sufferings of the Gaza people, for instance, and sometimes against their own suffering. You know, a very strange thing in many universities, the administration created some sort of a counseling instance, one psychologist, one professor, and so, to deal with the suffering of the students, because they suffer from what is going on in the world. And I find it a bit strange, you know. If you suffer for what is going on in the world, let's go, you know, do something. Just stop just to protest. So even politics now is a succession of moral statements without real actions. And in parallel to that, we have sheer violence. Sheer violence. And I would say something on sexual relations. We have a growing codification of gender relations, and apparently also a growing sexual violence. So that's the paradox of our time. The idea that this authoritarian pedagogy, in fact, doesn't solve the issue of violence. Violence is more visible because it's not understood in terms of culture, politics, etc. It's sheer violence. And so we don't know how to deal with wars, etc. Something which is rather new, we are confronted with unfinished wars. We know some of them, like Palestine-Israel conflict, it's very visible. But you have Sudan, you have Libya, you have East Africa, you have the Sahel, you have dozens of these unfinished wars. While I would say the wars in the good old time, so the First World War was not a nice war, but it was finished by a treaty, a change of the borders, and so on. It, of course, provided some problems which pushed us to the Second World War. But now, at a time when we have, you know, institutional bodies like the UN, the International Court of Justice, you know, at a time when we are more and more speaking about values, codification of relations, etc., we are confronted more and more with the sheer brutal violence, which doesn't come under our conceptual framework of what should be violence.
Thank you very much. And I'll go to you, but I want to make this point. In a certain way, the language of violence is also non-ambiguous language. If somebody wants to kill you, you're going to get it. And I do believe that this is the problem. This is one of the reasons there is a lot of empirical studies. The more kind of a complex society is in terms of different cultures and so on, the violence used by police is much higher. I know that also there is acoustic problem, but on this we cannot do much. But normally there is an empirical studies that shows that kind of one of the costs for cultural diversity is much more police violence. It's not by accident that in the United States the level of police violence are very high. Historically, because in a certain way you can never be sure what the other side really understands, that you should try to codify. And I find this really critically important, that one of the side effects of this kind of a non-ambiguous language is the rise of another non-ambiguous language, and this is the language of violence. But now, because I'm sure that you have your questions, your comments, and so on, Adam Schatz is almost jumping. So the first question is coming. Please, Adam. You should take your mic, because otherwise nobody else is going to hear your question. Yeah.
Thanks, Olivier, for this wonderful conversation. I think to some members of the audience, it might seem peculiar that you have shifted the focus of your work in this recent book from from the Islamic world and also from questions of the politics of integration and faith in France. But in fact, this book very much grows out of the work that you've done previously. There's an obvious thread that links them, particularly this whole question of deculturation. It seems to me that so much of your work, whether it's on political Islam or whether it's on the shift from an implicit culture of shared understandings to this kind of this sort of tyranny of norms, as it were, that you've always been producing a kind of a reflection on the modern condition in the age of globalization. And so I'm wondering whether you could talk about how you came to this subject, which seems like a departure, but to me at least seems to move very much in continuity with your previous writing.
Yeah, first, I started my professional life as a school teacher in a small town west of Paris. And this town is interesting for many reasons. One is we have a very, very high percentage of migrants. Now it's more than 30, probably 40%. Secondly, it was the town where the National Front made its first breakthrough in terms of elections. They won the election, municipal election in '84. And I was a school teacher, so I had Muslims in my class, etc. And I was able to follow the life of these people for 50 years. Now my former school children, they are grandmothers and on pension. So I have 50 years of observation. And of course, when I saw that some of this young second generation were turning to Salafism, going back to religion, I knew their parents. And the parents were very traditional, most often illiterate, Moroccans. The Turks were literate, but not the Moroccans. Nice people, but not politicized. My first question on what is happening in the mind of these young guys. So I started to study Islamic radicalization by looking at what was going on in my own classroom. At the same time, I was going to Afghanistan, but as a backpacker, not as a hashish smoker. There are many people who think that it was the main reason. No. I was a backpacker. I went hitchhiking, from Paris to Kabul. So it was not politically minded at all. I fell in love with the country. I learned the language, that's all. And when the Soviets invaded the country, I said, okay, nobody knows Afghanistan, there is no expertise. I will take a leave and I will look at this anti-Soviet guerrilla. So I shifted from a leftist guerrilla to a rightist one. Now, it was a Muslim, very fundamentalist guerrilla movement against the so-called progressist, Russian progressists who wanted to emancipate with guns the Afghan women. So, a story which is not finished. So I went to them, and then I found what is common. How do you politicize yourself? What can make you love war and violence? How war is changing the social relations? Because in war, in a very traditional country, the people who are now leading the movement are young, educated people. So you have the total change of the social hierarchy. They cannot, when you have a guerrilla war, you need some sort of an ideology. So they were turning Islam into a political ideology by using, exactly the same, I would say, structure than communism. Politically, you had the Islamist party was exactly a communist party, except that you change the adjectives and you put a bird. But the way of thinking, to create an utopian society is the same. So then I started to make a comparative analysis of political movements, armed movements. I was in the Soviet Union in the early 90s, and I saw, you know, better, but the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was extraordinary because nothing happened. You woke up a morning, and you are no more a citizen of the Soviet system. The police doesn't know what to do, the army has disappeared, the pensions are not paid, but nothing happens. So you have a trauma, a sudden deculturation. All your cultural markers and so disappeared. And how do you reconstruct that? And one is violence, you know. Okay, well. And I started to study fundamentalism. And I understood very rapidly that fundamentalism is not the reaction of a traditional Muslim society. On the contrary, fundamentalism does appear when the traditional culture is in crisis. So it explains why in Afghanistan, Islamism took the lead during the war, because the traditional society was in crisis. The old traditional notables had nothing to say. And the new generation of fighters, armored fighters, they have something to say. So, same thing with Salafism. Why did Salafism was so strong in the French banlieue, suburbs? Because the second generation youth was totally deculturalized. The language was French, the language of the grandfather was Moroccan Arab, and so. Nothing was transmitted by the parents, who were mostly illiterated. The parents were believers, but when they tried to speak about Islam to their children who used, you know, to go to school, to smoke hashish, to steal cars, and so on, so it was a total mismatch. The youth found nothing in what the parents said. The youth considered that their parents were losers. So they reinvented a normative Islam and a combative Islam. Something, you know, it's both an identity and a codification of everyday life, etc. That was Salafism. But then I look at the Christians, and I found with the evangelicals and so things which are very, very comparable. The rise of evangelicalism, so I studied the rise of evangelicalism, and I found the same patterns except political violence, at least in Europe. On the other hand, you had a crisis in the Catholic Church. The Council of Vatican has undermined the traditional Catholic culture. Maybe they had no choices. You know, maybe this traditional Catholic culture was out. You know. So the church tried to adapt. You know. But in fact, the church was engaged in a process of secularization of itself and so on. And what we have from the 60s is not just secularization. It was done in Europe. It was de-Christianization. We had a de-Christianization in 20, 30 years. In Quebec, it's in 10 years. And so how to reconstruct a faith when suddenly your religion is totally out of the dominant culture. You don't recognize yourself in the dominant culture. For centuries, the dominant secular culture in Europe was a secularized Christian culture. The conception of family, of gender, the criminalization of homosexuality, it was the same, except divorce. That was the only. But suddenly, the society started to adopt new values, a new definition of gender. It started with the hippies in the 60s, but in fact, in less than 30 years, these new values have been embedded into the laws in all Europe. So a part of the traditional Catholics suddenly found themselves totally out of the dominant culture. So they started to reconstruct a very normative and authoritarian conception of Catholicism. The phenomenon is complex. In the USA, the evangelicals are on the right. In Europe, it's more complex because the evangelicals are recruiting largely among second-generation migrants. I have, in the same time, last April, in France, we had the traditional pilgrimage to Chartres. It was a rightist, conservative pilgrimage. Everybody was all white. Boy Scouts in uniforms, Mass in Latin, flags and banners with references to the king, to royalty, to the Crusades, etc., etc. 20,000 people. The next week, we had in Paris, a Marche pour Jésus, a walk for Jesus, 20,000 people, organized by the evangelicals. And here it was, this kind of noisy, loud, modern music with drums and so, most in English, a crowd of young people clasping their hands, I love Jesus, and so. And it was totally mixed in ethnic terms. Blacks, Arabs, because we are many conversions. Blacks, Arabs, whites, totally mixed. So it's not Islam versus Christianity. We have now different forms of Christianity. So it's where I studied deculturation, the codification. It's starting with religion. And then I shifted to what is called now wokism, because in this sense, what we call wokism, I don't like the term, but okay, let's take it. For me, it's a secular fundamentalism. It's on the same lines that when we have lost a shared culture, we reconstruct our relations in terms of norms, moral norms, because we cannot put these norms on the past, on culture, no. So this normativization of life, of everyday life, is done not exactly the same way, but very comparable among both the traditionalists and what we call the progressives now. And the last point is there is no more an utopia, no more utopia. Until now, when the revolutionary youth, we were fighting for an utopia. Fortunately, we lost, because it would have been absolutely terrible if we had been able to succeed. We lost. But we were thinking in terms of an utopia. And now nobody is thinking in terms of an utopia. The ecologists, they fear the future, rightly. But they say, if we go on like that, the world is finished. So they want to stop the march of history. They don't want to have history. They want to stop. The term conservative is used in politics, but also conservationist to protect the nature. It's very interesting, the same term. So they fear the future, the youth now. And the faithful, most of the religious people, now they think that we are going to apocalypse. Some think it's okay, let's have apocalypse and we'll go to heaven. That's the American evangelicals. So we have a political view. That's our political reason, which is not very engaging.
Thank you very much. There was one question here, one day. Albena, okay, can I suggest you, because we have around 15 minutes, to take the questions there so you can answer, otherwise people are not going to be able. So there was a question here, Albena. Can I give you the microphone because you're... Okay, sorry. What I was going to say was something very technical. And this was that my suggestion is to take the questions and then basically go back to you. Because if you're going to answer every question on its own, we are going to have not more than one or two questions. So please, Albena.
No, thank you very much. You made me understand one of the reasons why Eastern Europe went so wrong. I mean, Ivan has written about it, but right after the collapse of communism, the footnote disappeared. So there was no longer any effort to translate the literature of the world for Bulgarians to understand it. So they could imagine, fantasize, desire the West, but they didn't even bother to understand what the rule of law means beyond the imposition of the law. Anyway, that's just to thank you for this insight. Okay, I share your criticism of wokeism, of identity politics, but let's not forget that woke means to be aware of injustice. Identity politics were imposed in order to empower structurally oppressed people. So what would you suggest to replace that?
Okay, thank you. I have a short but quite difficult question to answer, I'm afraid. What does all that mean for the cohesion of our societies? Thank you.
I'll just make a quick comment and then add the question. The youth are, it seems to me, totally utopian. The idea of stopping history, the idea that the past lives in the present, the idea of a totally just world, this is utopia. But my question was, aren't you being a bit pessimistic about Globish? Globish comes in the European Union, which is an attempt to create an alliance of states which is powerful enough to compete on the world stage. And you see Britain today attempting to come back into the migration system because on your own you can't deal with world problems. You need a language of communication. And as the speaker last night said, we all have the devices in our pockets which connect us to everybody in the world. And although Twitter and Facebook are much more localized than we imagine, nonetheless, the rise of this form of communication offers all kinds of hopes, doesn't it? As you said, manga. I mean, could you be a little bit more optimistic about the future of global communication in a world where, I mean, as you travel in Europe, you're struck by how rooted people are in their local cultures. As someone who's just moved to Austria a month ago, it's shocking, it's surprising.
Hey, so I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I would refer to your experience of the students who were, choosing instead of like they were going to fight, and now they don't. They just go to protest. It's very unfortunate that we're in a situation when you have this choice. You can't just protest against something. You need to go and fight. But I think in less drastic situation, what would be this advice or an opportunity? What is that? Because it's if you don't advise them to fight, what would you advise? Thank you.
Easy questions. Social cohesion, optimism. Whom you are going to fight and where?
My problem with work is not about justice. The problems they are pointing are real problems, gender relations, for instance, and the idea that there are, the big difference about identity politics on the right and identity politics on the left is not about identity. They both different identity. But of the left, they add the idea of suffering. We should support the people whose identity is suffering for different reasons. While what is interesting is now the right is also adopting the concept of suffering. The right say we are suffering. A good story is the artistic event for the opening of the Olympic Games in Paris. It's very interesting. So there was a scene where who could look like the Last Supper, with the naked guy in the place of Jesus. The guy said that he didn't see any resemblance with the Last Supper. It doesn't matter. So the church protested, saying that it's an insult on our emotions, feelings, identity, faith, etc., etc. But the guy of the extreme left, Mélenchon, he supported the church. And he said, yes, the Catholics now, they are like the Muslims, like the LGBT, like the Palestinians. They are a suffering now group, and we should protect all the minority groups who are suffering of the domination. The church was not very happy about this support. A huge part of the left was not happy at all, okay? But he's right in this sense. So that's the problem with with the workers is that they stick with moral judgment. Just a point, in the 60s, the Columbia students who protested for the civil rights, they went to Mississippi and Alabama. Now they sleep inside Columbia. They put their tents, and we say, Black Lives Matter. And many blacks are not happy about that. We are more segregated because before we were in the same demonstrations, and now you are in your campus. You are safe. It's a safe space. And you are supporting us, but what is going on in the streets? Cohesion, social cohesion, that's a big problem. And it's not just about deculturation. It's also about the way internet now is organizing the socialization. We are socializing in an imaginary spaces where we join only the people who are like us. So we have this kind of fan clubs or chats, so we have friends, but we don't know our neighbor. And probably our neighbor, in his room is also, sometimes we find that our neighbor is in the same imaginary group than we are. So, but we will not meet more. So there is a real problem of socialization. The social bind at the grassroots level is being destroyed. And nothing is being done to help that. We have a society more and more individualist, clearly. And our governments, whatever their political position, are not trying to recreate a social fabric at the grassroots levels. No, they are always speaking to individuals and making laws that deal with individuals. So the big issue is how to recreate from the basis to recreate or to maintain social binds. Globalization, yes, we could have an optimist view of globalization, and you have people who are the winners of globalization. I am part of the winners, I speak about globalization. So I am invited everywhere, books, so I am on the good side. But it's not very, we miss something. Of course, I can appear as nostalgic. It's true that I have the nostalgia of Afghanistan in the 60s, where there was no war. It was a fantastic people. The landscape was fantastic also, but it has nothing to do with the globalization. And this society is destroyed. I was in Yemen in the early 70s. Now I didn't dare to go back. Something is missing. Something has been destroyed. But of course, history is destruction, by definition. So I don't know. But it's true that my conclusion is quite pessimistic. It's true. My sons don't share my pessimism. They find that life is okay. They have no problems. No, they have many problems. But okay, they consider it livable and sometimes funny. So the good news is here. Don't ask me to change my mind, but if my children do not share my mind, that's the optimist conclusion.
This was really very optimistic. This was genuinely optimistic, and I do believe that at a certain age, if you're not nostalgic, you're dead. And I was trying, before the end, to try to imagine a joke that is not going to be destroyed by the absence of culture. And in Bulgarian culture, there is such a joke. Two men are sitting on a table in a restaurant, and for 3 hours, nobody pronounces a word. And after 3 hours, one said, okay, let's stop talking about money. And, and I do believe that this one is going to work. So Olivier, thank you so much for the talk.